around because they look Somali. Are ICE agents stopping people because they look, quote unquote, Somali?
No, they're not. You know, the law requires agents are trained in Fourth Amendment training every 6 months. Border Patrol's trained in Fourth Amendment training. They stop. You can detain and question people for a short period of time based on reasonable suspicion.
That's and what is that suspicion?
Federal statute.
Is it based on how they look?
No, their appearance alone can't raise reasonable suspicion. It's articulable facts, a lot of different facts taken into consideration. And the Supreme Court just backed the Trump administration up on this. I know a lot of the media says, oh, the Supreme Court just justified racial profiling. That's not what the Supreme Court said. Supreme Court said they agree with the way these operations are being conducted.
Listen to how he says it with that absolute certainty dripping from every syllable, like he's handing down commandments from on high. This performative denial wrapped in the gauze of institutional procedure that we've seen 1,000 times before, because when power speaks about its own excesses, always deploys the language of process and training and reasonable suspicion, as if those magical incantations can somehow wash away what entire communities are experiencing in real time as they carry their passports in their own neighborhoods, while their children cry for their fathers in the street. And do you understand what we just witnessed in this clip? Because this is the entire architecture of structural racism condensed into a 2-minute exchange where an ICE agent detained a U.S. citizen after learning he was a citizen before releasing him, and yet Homan still insists appearance alone can't raise reasonable suspicion, even as community leaders report ICE is looking for Somali immigrants but snatching everyone, whether they are Somali, Ethiopian, Eritrean, or Oromo, because they don't know the difference. And this right here is the bombshell that should shake every single person who cares about constitutional rights, because what we're watching is the brazen implementation of a Supreme Court decision that clears the way for racial profiling during immigration raids and sweeps. And Homan invokes that very decision as vindication, as if the Supreme Court saying something makes it morally right, rather than legally permissible, under a deeply conservative court that has spent the entire year systematically dismantling civil rights protections. And here comes the second bombshell dropping like a judicial atomic weapon, because the Supreme Court cleared the way for a person's ethnicity to be at least a partial factor behind immigration stops by law enforcement, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote in a concurring opinion that a person's ethnicity can be a relevant factor for agents to initiate immigration-related stops, which means the highest court in the land just gave federal agents permission to stop you for looking a certain way, for speaking a certain language, for existing in a certain body, and this is happening right now in December 2025, as approximately 100 ICE officers and agents from around the country descended on Minneapolis, specifically targeting the Somali community. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey warned that mistakes will be made, and it means that American citizens will be detained for no other reason than the fact that they look like they are Somali, which isn't speculation or hyperbole, because it's already happened, and continues to happen as we speak. But wait, because the third bombshell is even more devastating, when you understand the demographics at play here, because nearly 58% of Somalis in Minnesota were born in the U.S., and of the foreign-born Somalis in Minnesota, an overwhelming majority at 87% are naturalized U.S. citizens, which means this operation is fundamentally not about immigration enforcement, but about terrorizing an entire community based on their ethnicity and religion, and you can see the evidence everywhere because pockets and purses hung a little heavier with immigration documents and passports, as the specter of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown loomed, and American citizens are carrying proof of citizenship in their own country like we've regressed to some apartheid nightmare where your papers determine whether masked federal agents can snatch you off the street. Think about the absolute audacity of Homan sitting there citing Fourth Amendment training every 6 months like that's some kind of magical shield against unconstitutional behavior when a federal judge found a mountain of evidence that immigration agents were violating the constitutional rights of residents in Los Angeles before the Supreme Court stepped in to override that lower court ruling. And here's where we need to understand the philosophical framework at work, because this is Foucauldian biopower in its most naked form, where the state claims the authority to categorize bodies to determine which bodies belong, and which bodies are suspect, which bodies can move freely, and which bodies must constantly prove their right to exist in public space. And when Homan says articulable facts and reasonable suspicion, what he's really describing is a taxonomy of suspicion that maps perfectly onto racial and ethnic markers. The fourth bombshell should make every progressive's blood boil, because the ICE raids came on the heels of Trump rescinding temporary protected status for Somali residents, effectively depriving them of legal status, which reveals the entire operation as a deliberate sequence: first strip away legal protections, then deploy enforcement, then claim you're just following the law, and Trump said he did not want Somali immigrants in the United States, claiming that residents of the East African country contributed nothing, and called them garbage, which is dehumanizing rhetoric straight from the fascist playbook, and we cannot let this language become normalized because once you establish that certain groups are garbage, you've created the ideological justification for any level of state violence against them. And here's the fifth bombshell that connects this to the broader authoritarian project, because Homan launched a border-focused project in collaboration with the United West, a Southern poverty law center designated anti-Muslim hate group, and the project has been criticized for promoting inflammatory rhetoric about immigration and Muslim, which means the man implementing these policies has direct organizational ties to designated hate groups, and Homan joined the Heritage Foundation in 2022 and became a contributor to Project 2025, which proposed exactly these kinds of mass deportation operations, and this isn't some conspiracy theory, this is documented fact, that the architect of family separation policies, who was among the most strident proponents of the Trump administration's family separation policy as a means of deterring illegal entry, is now back with expanded powers and a Supreme Court that just handed him a blank check to engage in racial profiling. But let's get to the sixth bombshell about what reasonable suspicion actually means in practice, because, according to Trump's Solicitor General, apparent ethnicity can be a factor supporting reasonable suspicion in appropriate circumstances, which translates to if a federal agent thinks someone looks illegal, the agent should be free to seize that person based only on his apparent ethnicity. The Trump administration told the Supreme Court that the high prevalence of illegal aliens should enable agents to stop a relatively broad range of individuals based on factors such as the individual's apparent ethnicity, so they're not even hiding it anymore. They're explicitly arguing for the right to stop a broad range of people based on how they look, and the Supreme Court said yes, go ahead and do that. The seventh bombshell reveals the human cost in ways that should haunt us, because patients are canceling appointments at clinics serving marginalized communities because they're afraid to come out of their homes. Restaurants are sitting half empty, and the fear isn't contained to just clinics. It can be seen throughout the community, which represents the precise goal of these operations. Because as scholars of authoritarianism have documented, the point isn't just deportation. The point is creating an atmosphere of pervasive fear that makes entire communities retreat from public life, that makes people afraid to seek health care, to go to work, to send their children to school, and this is collective punishment against an ethnic and religious minority. Entire neighborhoods have been under lockdown due to fear of being detained, and programs at community buildings were canceled, and buildings were closed after ICE agents showed up, which means federal immigration enforcement is shutting down the social infrastructure of entire communities. ICE detained a man as he was driving his kids home, and after detaining him, agents left the man's car idling in the middle of the street, with his children crying for their father, and if that image doesn't radicalize you into action, I don't know what will, because this is state violence against families, state violence against children who will carry this trauma for the rest of their lives. The ninth bombshell connects to the broader pattern of Supreme Court capitulation because Justice Sotomayor wrote in dissent that in the last 8 months, this court's appetite to circumvent the ordinary appellate process and weigh in on important issues has grown exponentially, but its interest in explaining itself unfortunately has not, which means the court is issuing these sweeping decisions that overturn lower court findings of constitutional violations without even providing reasoned analysis. Sotomayor argued, we should not have to live in a country where the government can seize anyone who looks Latino, speaks Spanish, and appears to work a low-wage job, but that's exactly the country we're living in right now in December 2025. Here's the 10th bombshell about who's actually being arrested because ICE announced at least 12 arrests with less than half of the announced arrestees being Somali, according to ICE. And ICE agents have been going after Latino immigrants as well since there's a dearth of deportable Somalis to detain, which reveals the entire operation as a bait and switch, where they announce a Somali-targeted operation that whips up racial animus and justifies expanded enforcement powers, then use those powers to sweep up anyone who looks like they might be undocumented, creating this dragnet that Justice Sotomayor warned about when she wrote allowing the seizure of any Latino speaking Spanish at a car wash in Los Angeles tramples the constitutional requirement that officers must have a particularized and objective basis for suspecting the particular person stopped. And the 11th bombshell takes us back to the historical parallels, because legal experts note this is leading us back to Korematsu, the notorious decision upholding Japanese internment, and it seems like the Trump administration is reaching into that dustbin of history, taking out Korematsu, dusting it off, and presenting it right back to the Supreme Court. And we cannot let this comparison seem hyperbolic, because we're watching the construction of a legal framework that says the government can target entire ethnic communities for enhanced surveillance and detention based on national security rationales that are transparently pretextual and rooted in racism, and when its experts note, they can't think of a time in recent U.S. history that a sitting U.S. president has called the people from an entire country garbage. We're in unprecedented territory of presidential incitement to racial hatred. The 12th bombshell reveals the infrastructure of this deportation regime, because video shows people with shackled hands and feet getting into airplanes at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, as activists believe this is one of several flights taking immigrants arrested by ICE out of the state, and these charter flights are going to Louisiana, which the New York Times describes as the deportation capital of the U.S., and we're watching the construction of what scholars are calling the deportation industrial complex, a massive apparatus of detention facilities, charter flights, private contractors, and federal agents all dedicated to the project of mass removal. And when you follow the money, ICE's fiscal year 2025 budget at $28.7 billion is triple its fiscal year 2024 budget, and Homan worked as a paid consultant for Geo Group, a major detention services provider. So there are massive financial incentives driving this machinery of human suffering. Now here's where we need to talk about what Homan isn't saying when he claims agents receive Fourth Amendment training, because training doesn't mean compliance, and procedure doesn't equal justice, and we have mountains of evidence from civil rights organizations documenting constitutional violation by ICE, but those violations occur within a framework that the Supreme Court has now essentially blessed, and this is how systemic racism works. It's not individual agents acting out of personal animus, although that certainly happens. It's an entire institutional apparatus with formal procedures, legal justifications that produces racially discriminatory outcomes, and then defends those outcomes by pointing to the procedures themselves. And let's be absolutely clear about what reasonable suspicion means in the context Homan describes, because he says appearance alone can't raise suspicion. It's articulable facts, multiple factors taken into consideration. The previous court order barred immigration officers from targeting individuals based solely on broad factors such as their perceived ethnicity, speaking Spanish or English with an accent, being present in specific locations such as a car wash, or the type of work they do. And when you combine ethnicity plus language, plus location plus type of work, you've essentially created a profile that targets working-class Latino and Somali communities, and calling it articulable facts doesn't make it any less racially discriminatory. It just provides legal cover for racial profiling. The 13th bombshell should galvanize resistance, because an imam said Trump's comments become permission, a permission of harassment, a permission for profiling, and a permission for violence, and he referenced when a 2017 bomb attack against a mosque in Bloomington, Minnesota, intended to terrorize Muslims into believing they are not welcome in the United States and should leave the country, according to a Justice Department brief. So there's documented history of this rhetoric leading to violence. Community members report a sharp rise in threats, a sharp rise in harassment and openly hostile rhetoric directed at the Somali and Muslim community, and some members now carry passports out of fear of being wrongly targeted, which creates a climate of fear that is itself a form of state violence. Here's the philosophical core we need to grasp, because what we're witnessing is the collision between formal legal equality and substantive racial hierarchy, where the Constitution ostensibly protects everyone equally, but the interpretation and application of constitutional protections varies dramatically based on race, ethnicity, and immigration status. And this contradiction has been present since the founding. But what makes this moment so dangerous is that we're watching the Supreme Court systematically dismantle even the formal protections that civil rights movements fought for decades to establish, and they're doing it through the emergency docket, through shadow docket rulings, without grappling with the content of lower court decisions that found constitutional violations. The 14th bombshell reveals how this operation functions as political theater, because Trump's renewed focus on Somali immigrants comes following publication of an article claiming with little evidence that Somali-American immigrants accused of defrauding Minnesota's public programs are providing money to the terrorist group Al-Shabaab, and terrorism financing has not been among the fraud-related charges, but the mere suggestion creates this association between an entire community and terrorism, which then justifies militarized enforcement, and this is classic scapegoating where complex social problems get reduced to the presence of a demonized minority group and the solution becomes removal of that group rather than addressing underlying structural issues. And we need to talk about the intersectionality of this oppression, because Homan's project shares staff and an address with a designated anti-Muslim hate group and held a fundraising event at Mar-a-Lago, which reveals this isn't just about immigration enforcement, it's about Islamophobia and anti-black racism and xenophobia, all converging on Somali Muslims, who represent the intersection of multiple marginalized identities, and the Trump administration can mobilize multiple forms of bigotry, simultaneously calling them criminals, calling them terrorists, calling them welfare frauds, calling them garbage, and each narrative reinforces the others in a symphony of dehumanization. Here's the 15th bombshell about legal resistance because community rapid response groups tracking ICE report, feeling it with cases where ICE is showing up at 3 or 4 locations across the Twin Cities, and immigration attorneys say it's been difficult to keep track of operations, and they're trying their best, but it's a game of whack-a-mole. But you don't have a hammer, you've got a toothpick, which illustrates how the sheer scale and speed of enforcement overwhelms the capacity of legal advocates to respond. And this is deliberate strategy to make resistance difficult, to fragment opposition, to create so many fires that people can't possibly put them all out. And let's discuss the broader authoritarian playbook, because at the National Conservatism Conference, Homan said, if Trump comes back, he'll run the biggest deportation force this country has ever seen, and they ain't seen shit yet, wait until 2025. And at the Republican National Convention, he told millions of illegal aliens to start packing and you're going home. So this was announced, this was promised, this was the explicit platform, and yet we're still supposed to treat it as normal policy debate, as if there are reasonable arguments on both sides, when one side is advocating for mass detention and deportation, targeting ethnic and religious minorities. The 16th bombshell connects to sanctuary city resistance because both Minneapolis and St. Paul are sanctuary cities, meaning their local police do not question residents' immigration status or enforce immigration law, which is a federal responsibility. Minneapolis Mayor Frey signed an order prohibiting federal immigration authorities from using municipal lots to stage operations and created a signage template for local businesses who want to mark their property as off-limits, which represents the kind of local resistance we need to see, but it's insufficient without federal policy change and congressional action and massive social movement pressure, because local sanctuary policies can slow this machine, but they can't stop it when federal agents can simply ignore local restrictions. And here's where we have to talk about media complicity, because look at how the reporter frames the question, asking whether agents are stopping people because they look Somali, and Homan gets to flatly deny it, gets to invoke training and procedure, and the Supreme Court, and unless you're reading deep in the coverage, understanding the context, knowing what's happening on the ground, you might come away thinking, well, he denied it, he cited legal standards, maybe those community complaints are exaggerated, and this is how institutional racism maintains itself, through official denials, through procedural justifications, through the veneer of legality that obscures the lived reality of communities under siege. The 17th bombshell reveals the economic dimensions, because almost 3/4 of ICE detainees have no criminal convictions, which destroys the narrative that this is about public safety, and ICE called the 12 people arrested some of the worst criminal illegal aliens, but 8 of them had been charged or convicted of crimes, including assault, fraud, domestic violence, and driving under the influence. So 4 of the 12, which is a third, had no criminal record at all, and the crimes of the others are misdemeanors and low-level offenses, not the violent criminals they're being portrayed as. And this bait and switch where they announce operations targeting dangerous criminals, then sweep up anyone they can, is classic security theater. We need to understand the Supreme Court's role with absolute clarity, because the court temporarily halted a Los Angeles judge's order that barred roving patrols from snatching people off California streets based on how they look, what language they speak, or where they happen to be, and both the Los Angeles federal court and the Ninth Circuit had ruled these actions amounted to illegal racial profiling, but the Supreme Court overruled those findings, and this order strongly signals the Supreme Court will not uphold strict constitutional limits on immigration agents' authority to stop and question people they suspect to be immigrants. And as Trump ramps up raids in other cities, we can expect federal agents to be emboldened by this decision. And here's the 18th bombshell about self-deportation strategy, because this has been an important pillar of policy, which is to make life feel so difficult for immigrants without papers, and with the Supreme Court decision also for Latinos and Spanish speakers, or those who speak with an accent, that the consideration is to self-deport, and this is the cruelty as policy. The goal isn't just removing undocumented immigrants, it's making life so unbearable that people choose to leave, and in the process you terrorize entire communities, including citizens, including legal residents, because the enforcement mechanisms can't distinguish, or more accurately, don't care to distinguish. Think about the staggering historical significance of what we're witnessing, because we're watching in real time the construction of a legal regime that permits racial profiling at a scale we haven't seen since Japanese internment, and the fact that it's being done with Supreme Court blessing with invocations of training and procedure with claims about reasonable suspicion makes it more dangerous, not less dangerous, because it creates the appearance of legality, the pretense of constitutional compliance, while gutting the Fourth Amendment's protections for entire communities. Future historians will look back at this moment and ask, where was the resistance? Where was the mass mobilization? Where were the politicians willing to stand up? The 19th bombshell reveals intersectional solidarity because, with a dearth of deportable Somalis to detain ICE agents have been going after Latino immigrants instead, and the rest of the immigrant community in the Twin Cities is on alert, which shows how operations targeting one community endanger all immigrant communities, and this should be a rallying point for multiracial coalition building because they came for the Somalis first, but the infrastructure of enforcement, the legal precedents, the normalized practices will be deployed against anyone deemed suspicious, and we've seen this pattern throughout history, where rights violations against marginalized groups become precedents for broader applications against larger populations. And here's the 20th bombshell about normalization, because
this was a centerpiece of Trump's campaign. This was the promise, and the promise contained a fallacy about taking criminals and rapists off the streets. But we know from criminological studies that immigrants and undocumented immigrants do not commit crimes at the same rate as American citizens. Yet,
recent polling from the end of summer indicates an overwhelming majority of Republican voters still support Trump's approach, though some conservatives are expressing in hushed tones that they're no longer comfortable with this, or it's affecting their business, and we need that discomfort to become loud public opposition. Listen to what's at stake here, because when Homan claims the Supreme Court backed the Trump administration up, he's technically correct, but that doesn't make it right, and we cannot cede the moral ground by accepting Supreme Court rulings as the final word on justice. When the court has been wrong before, was wrong about Dred Scott, was wrong about Plessy, was wrong about Korematsu, and is wrong now about permitting ethnicity as a factor in immigration stops. And we need a massive social movement that treats this court's rulings not as legitimate constitutional interpretation, but as political decisions by unelected conservative justices implementing an authoritarian agenda. The 21st bombshell demands our attention because, experts note, the operation announced amid rising vitriol against Minnesota's Somali diaspora isn't likely to result in booming deportations, since the Somali community is largely made up of American citizens and permanent residents, and this ultimately isn't going to yield results in terms of numbers of arrests or removal, but is absolutely a racist weaponization of ICE against an entire community. So the cruelty is the point, the terror is the point, the message sending is the point, and we're watching collective punishment being inflicted on a community for political theater to satisfy Trump's base to demonstrate strength through brutality. And we must connect this to the broader fascist trajectory, because Trump has appeared to focus on immigrants from developing countries with harsh remarks or policies, except for white South Africans for whom the U.S. has increased quotas, and at the end of October the Trump administration reduced the number of refugees the U.S. will accept to just 7,500, the lowest since 1980, with preference given to white South Africans, which reveals the white supremacist core of these policies. This isn't about immigration. This isn't about crime. This isn't about national security. This is about who belongs in America, who gets to be American, who deserves protection, and who deserves persecution. Here's what progressive movements must understand with absolute clarity. This is not a debate about immigration policy. This is a fight over whether we will permit the federal government to engage in racialized mass detention and deportation, whether we will accept Supreme Court decisions that gut constitutional protections, whether we will allow the construction of a surveillance and enforcement apparatus that targets communities based on ethnicity and religion, and the answer must be an unequivocal no, and that no must be backed by mass protest, by civil disobedience, by sanctuary organizing, by legal resistance, by electoral mobilization, by every tool we have, because if we normalize this, if we accept this as the new normal, we will have crossed a threshold that future generations will not forgive. What we just watched in that clip is a man with a recently closed FBI investigation into allegations he was accepting bribes from border security companies, sitting on television lying smoothly about constitutional protections while communities live in fear, and that smooth lie delivered with bureaucratic precision is more dangerous than crude racism because it provides cover, it creates deniability, it lets people who don't want to see the reality look away and tell themselves the system is working properly, and we cannot let that happen. We must force this nation to confront what is being done in its name, to recognize that articulable facts and reasonable suspicion and Fourth Amendment training are just euphemisms for racial profiling, backed by the Supreme Court, and we must resist with everything we have, because this is the test of our generation, and we cannot fail.